Hi, I'm your moderator, Sandro Monetti. Superhero therapy helps patients with anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Well, let's find out how it all works from the acclaimed psychologist who developed it. Welcome, Dr. Janina Scarlet.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. What an honor. Thank you.
Every superhero has their own origin story, and so do you. It's more special than most. I understand you survived Chernobyl, you survived the persecution that came afterwards, and this all sort of shaped your worldview. Tell us your own origin story.
Thank you. Thank you. I think everyone has their own very special and unique origin story. And yes, mine began in Ukraine, where I was born and raised. And like a lot of Marvel characters, I too was exposed to radiation, in this case, Chernobyl radiation. Still waiting, for my spidey senses and, Hulk-like abilities. But my childhood was spent mostly in and out of the hospital. And to this day, I still have side effects, such as whenever the weather changes, I get very, very ill. I get severe migraines and sometimes seizures. And when Soviet Union broke up, there was a lot of prejudice against Ukrainian people, excuse me, in Ukraine against Jewish people, and my family and I were targeted. And so thankfully we were able to escape to United States as refugees. But coming to United States at the age of 12, not speaking English, being that odd kid from another world, essentially, I felt like a freak. I felt like there was something wrong with me. I, like a lot of other children, endured bullying, but because nobody talked about mental health, I thought that I deserved it. I thought that there was something wrong with me for having depression or anxiety or trauma. And I didn't know any of those terms back then. I just knew that I felt like I was different, like I didn't fit in. And then when I was 16, I was working in a movie theater, and as a part of my job, we were all asked to go to the midnight screening of the X-Men. And I didn't know anything about the X-Men except that they were some kind of superheroes, and I didn't know much about superheroes at the time. And from the moment the movie started, I felt like the movie was made for me. The movie started with Eric's family being dragged away to a concentration camp, and all four of my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. And so immediately I was hooked, and I felt really connected to the characters. But as the movie continued, I realized that every character, all the mutants, all the X-Men, somehow felt prejudiced against. They felt like they were different from other people. And it really caught my heart. And as I was watching this film, it really made me aware of how connected I felt to this film. But then as I started looking around the movie theater, I realized the movie was sold out. Everyone was paying attention. The movie made a lot of money. It was written by very successful people. And then I realized this fundamental truth that we all feel alone, that we all feel like we're different, that we're all X-Men in a way, but because we don't talk about it, we don't realize it. We all have our own origin stories, but it's in our aloneness that we're all the same. And so it was because of this movie that I realized that maybe we don't really talk about our mental health because we don't know how, but maybe we can use fiction as a bridge to understand about our experiences and find a safe way to talk about our experiences. So it was because of this movie that I signed up for psychology in high school and never looked back. And now this is what I specialize in.
Wonderful. The circumstances that you went through could have been the breaking of so many people. Instead, they were the making of you. Um, was there something other than that trip to the X-Men movie that gave you the inner strength to survive and thrive?
I kind of have to argue that it's both. It was a breaking point. I have been broken and I still feel broken, but I don't think that's a bad thing. In Japan, when in ancient Japan anyway, when a dish or a bowl would break, they would glue it back together with gold, and then that bowl is a lot more valuable. And I think that we all go through heartaches and we all go through trauma and we all are broken in some way, but I think it's about changing the way we look at it. I think that our experiences of brokenness make us wiser and more valuable, and those cracks in our heart get filled with gold in terms of love. And I think that you can't have one without the other. So I think that yes, it was the connection with superheroes and my love for other people and my love for pop culture. But I also think that understanding that broken doesn't mean bad really allowed me to kind of combine these two together.
Explain to us how superhero therapy actually works. I imagine you're not writing a prescription that says watch 3 Marvel movies and a DC.
Oh, I do,
Oh, you
actually.
do. Yes.
So the first session, I usually ask my clients about their presenting problem, what's bringing them in, and I specialize in helping folks with PTSD. So usually we talk about at least a little bit about the trauma as well as their history, etc. And then the last 15 minutes of the first session, I usually reserved for me getting to know the client's geeky side, right? What are some of the movies, video games, TV shows? What are you all about? And then in the next few sessions, we work on establishing an origin story. So we work on redefining the client's traumatic experience as their origin story, meaning just the beginning, right? But the rest of the client's life, the rest of their journey is up to them. So we look at different kind of heroes, whether it's Batman or the Doctor or Wonder Woman or the X-Men, as a kind of a guide, a compassionate guide that allows that person to get through some of these experiences in a way that Gandalf led Frodo, for example. So we'll have certain meditation experiences where the client will ask their guide for some advice or for some support. So they'll have a conversation with Batman, for example, who might encourage them and remind them that even if they're scared, that it might be worthwhile to take certain steps to, let's say, reach out to their friends or to apply to that school or their job that they want to apply to, or invest in their creativity. And then we work on developing a sense of purpose, right? Like if you had to design your own comic book, your own kind of movie, what would you want it to be about? What kind of a hero would you want to be? And then we look at taking specific steps to following that journey. And so my goal as a therapist is to help my clients to become their own version of a superhero in real life.
Your work has been acknowledged in so many cool ways. How did it feel to become portrayed as a comic book character yourself in the graphic novel 7 Days?
Oh my gosh, I still don't believe it. I periodically have to look at it to make sure that I'm not imagining it. Gail emailed me a few years ago and asked if it would be okay to base a character on me. And at first I thought she would just have a psychologist in her story. I didn't think much of it. And then later I honestly thought she forgot all about it. And then when the comic came out and I bought it and I just thought there would be some kind of a mention of a psychologist. I opened it and on the very first page, there's a psychologist, a redheaded psychologist called Dr. Janina Scarlet. And I burst into tears. It was just surreal.
You also received an award from the United Nations Association of America for this work. What did that kind of recognition mean to you?
I honestly, still, again, my imposter syndrome is telling me that I don't deserve it, that there are people that deserve it so much more. I'm incredibly grateful that mental health is acknowledged. This was the first award that was given away for mental health.
Mm.
And it really meant a lot that the United Nations Associations is really taking these huge steps to acknowledge the importance of mental health.
How do you get clients to open up? Because a lot of people who are struggling with the feelings that you've described today often feel too closed to share their story. How do you unlock that closure?
Yeah, I often start by trying to allow the client to feel safe. And usually, for many people that I'm working with anyway, it's by talking about something that they're really passionate about, like a movie, a TV show, a video game. And usually, people are passionate about it because they feel something. So if they're watching, let's say, the 10th Doctor, it's not just entertainment for them. It's that they see something in the Doctor or in one of the companions, whether we're talking about Rose, right, or Amy or whoever, they see something that they really want to relate to. And for a lot of people, they might find a surrogate friend or a part of themselves that they didn't have before. I'll have people say, you know how I felt when my friend died? I felt like when the Doctor and Rose got separated. And that makes sense, right? When people are able to explain their losses through that metaphor, it's easier for them to talk about what they went through. And so usually we'll start by talking about something that the client is really passionate about. I'll ask them what it means to them. And usually this is when they really come to life. And a lot of times that's when they start opening up. They might say, on my worst day, this is the game I play, or this is the show I watch, and this is why.
I've interviewed a lot of actors who play heroic characters, and what I notice is they're always incredibly moved to hear from fans how their work has touched the viewers in an emotional and even a healing way. What have you learned about the relationship between fans and the actors that they idolize, separate from the characters, which has informed your work?
Yeah, so from what I've seen, when the actors are able to uphold the kind of that wholeness, the wholesomeness of certain characters that they present, and they're able to make meaningful statements or engage with the fandom, it can be a matter of life and death. For example, the supernatural community has really done a wonderful job of talking about mental health and creating a safe space for the supernatural family members, right, to talk about their experiences. And there have been so many people that I've actually interviewed who said that because the actors have talked about their own mental health experiences and encouraged people to talk about their experiences or to seek counseling or to seek support groups, that people were more willing to be open and more willing to discuss these things and more willing to ask for help. And I do think that these are life-saving.
You currently work at the Center for Stress and Anxiety Management in San Diego. Can you describe your day-to-day work and maybe some of the more common situations that you deal with?
Sure. Well, after my cup of coffee and a cuddle with a cat, I work with a number of clients and we work on, again, trauma processing, but in a way of inviting the client to create their own hero's journey, such as by reaching out to members of their community or posting about their mental health experiences, making a YouTube video. A part of my day is also writing. So I'm working on several fiction or nonfiction works at a time in order to provide more education about these topics. And then usually at least once or twice a week, I'm teaching courses for people all over the world, for mental health providers, about how to use this type of therapy with their clients.
Um, do you ever speak to patients slash clients who just don't follow superhero culture and just dismiss it as not helpful to them? Do you see their point of view? Do you try and turn them around? What's your approach in those situations?
No, and if people don't like pop culture, that's perfectly fine. We can do just kind of standard therapy, and that's fine too. A lot of times, I do find that it might be helpful for somebody to think of a role model, which doesn't have to be a fictional character. It could be maybe a grandparent, if even if they're no longer alive. It could be a teacher they've had. It could be a celebrity, a historical figure, a religious figure, somebody that they look up to, and maybe there's a certain virtue that they really want to embody.
Is it true that every superhero and TV hero has a weakness or vulnerability, and what can we learn from the way they face those challenges or let me preface that by, is there any character who doesn't have any weaknesses at all or vulnerabilities?
So it depends on the way you're asking the question.
Hmm.
I don't think there are any characters that have a weakness. I think there are characters that have a vulnerability, and I think
Ah,
those are different. I think vulnerability is our greatest strength. So it's in vulnerability that we're able to find connections, that we're able to find love and express ourselves. And by definition, vulnerability is terrifying. When I was working with active duty Marines who just returned home from Afghanistan or Iraq, they would say that this, being in therapy and talking about their experiences, is scarier than being in combat. And so if it's scary and they're doing it anyway, that means it's courageous by definition. And what that means is that vulnerability is the most courageous thing of which humans are capable of. And so I think every hero has a vulnerability, just like every human has a vulnerability, but I think it's a point of strength.
Would Superman really see his vulnerability to kryptonite as a source of strength?
He might, He might, but I think it reminds him about humanity. I mean, certainly in combat, it's something he has to be aware of, right? So he might see it as something that could potentially impair him, but it's also what allows him to be connected to his human side. He's not human by birth; he's adopted, right? He's a refugee who's adopted, but I think in this way, he can feel like still a part of humanity.
When you are watching new films, new TV shows, is the way you watch them different from the way the rest of us sort of watch them? I mean, can you disconnect as a fan, or are you sitting there taking notes and thinking, "Oh, yes, I should mention that tomorrow in session"?
It depends. If I'm really into a particular fandom, I'm usually, first watching it as a fan, and then on a second go through, then I might be watching it more as a therapist. But a part of what I do is also noticing things. So even if I'm not thinking about it in terms of how I'm going to bring it up with the client, a lot of times I'm thinking about it in terms of, that character is suffering and I want to help. And so it's more of that almost like a surrogate friendship kind of way that I think many of us experience movies and television.
You mentioned before that you write some sort of fiction in your spare time. Tell us about that and which particular genres or shows or franchises inspire you there.
Thank you. Thank you. I am writing a dark fantasy novel right now, and it's about a witch with PTSD who goes to the underworld to work for Hades, and Hades has started an underworld intelligence agency to deal with supernatural forces. And so she's learning how to face supernatural monsters, but also learns that she has to face her internal monsters as well. And my hope is to make it an entertaining way to learn mental health skills and also to normalize mental health. Certainly largely inspired by Harry Potter and Doctor Who and Supernatural. And so there's a little bit of different things in there as well as Greek mythology.
When you think of a clinical psychologist's office, you have a certain image of how it's going to be. When I think of yours, I imagine it's surrounded by sort of action figures and posters. Is the truth somewhere in the middle? Give us a tour.
Yes. So I have my Black Widow, and I have the lighting's a little bit dark. I apologize, but I have my Wonder Woman there, and so I'm hoping to allow my clients to see right off the bat that I'm a geek and this is a safe space, and you can be yourself here, and nobody's going to judge you, and you can talk about anything that you feel comfortable talking about.
I'd be fascinated, as you mentioned Black Widow there, to get your take on Scarlett Johansson standing up to Disney over their pay dispute over Black Widow. A lot of time in the history of show business, I don't need to tell you, sort of women have been kept down, and here's someone who plays a hero, being strong and standing up to an entertainment empire and saying, no, this is not right. What was your particular take on maybe the bravery that took, or maybe you see it in a different way.
Yeah, great question. Um, You know, this is my personal opinion, and I think it took a lot of guts and a lot of courage for Scarlett Johansson to stand up, not just for herself, but for a lot of people, especially a lot of women in Hollywood that I think are being treated differently and differently than what they were promised, differently what was in their contract, and not to mention the disparity. And so I think it took a lot of courage for her to do that, and is very consistent with the character that she plays on the screen.
And that leads us to a wider argument, as someone who was admirably able to find her inner strength. How do you feel about the rise of female empowerment in pop culture? Something that's really been a real sort of turning of the page in recent years.
Yeah, I think it's long overdue. It's wonderful to see. I think we need to see a lot more diversity in general, diversity across sexes and gender identities and body sizes and mental health disorders and skin types and religions and all across the board. Because when people see themselves represented on the screen, they feel like they're not alone. And that sense of connection is everything.
If you're anything like most fans, you love a lot, but there's also something you hate and just cannot connect to. Is there any franchise, any success where you, with all your education and your charts and your certificates, say, I just don't get it?
Mm-mm. That's a really good question. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Um,
Wow.
I think everything probably has some kind of a quality. There are just some certain things I watch more than others, but I can't think of anything like that off the top of my head.
You're clearly a role model and a mentor to many people. And if you look at sort of real life and you look at sort of pop culture, a lot of our heroes, whether it's Mr. Miyagi or Yoda, have had that sort of inspirational figure on their hero journey. How important is that for people to find in their own lives? And if they don't have one, how can they find one?
Yeah. I think it's important. I don't think it's vital, but I think it's important because I think it gives people a framework for how they want to utilize their skills and a way to reconnect with their own sense of purpose and their inner wisdom. I think that when people don't have a role model like it, they can think about what they would have wanted, maybe when they were younger or when they were going through a hard time, and think about ways that they would want to become that kind of a role model to somebody else later on, and maybe take steps accordingly.
Your work has been featured everywhere from the BBC to NPR to the New York Times, Forbes, the Nerdist. How were you able to so well switch between different sort of media with different fan bases and readership and still maintain this same consistency of message?
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. I don't think it's different for me. I think I see it all as the same. Whether we're talking about one fandom, whether we're talking about one medium, I think the idea is the same. What we know is that we are pre-wired for connection. A recent research article actually says that loneliness is as damaging for our mental health as chronic smoking and chronic alcohol abuse. Not in terms of lung damage or liver damage, but in terms of the effects on our heart and our immune system. And what we know is that the opposite of that, meaningful social connection, can not only make us feel emotionally better, but can restore physiological functioning. And sometimes when we're missing these connections in real life, maybe when our friends or family don't understand us, we can create this surrogate connection with a fictional character. And whether we look at one fandom or another, I think it's the same across the board.
You have recovered and thrived from some really tough emotional scars, but I'm sure you're still on your healing journey. You are able to help so many people with their problems, but where do you go when you need help?
Yeah, great question. So I'm proud to say that I see my own therapist, and I think a lot of people can benefit from therapy. And my therapist has been absolutely wonderful at helping me to stay grounded and work on my skills. I'm lucky to have a wonderful partner and wonderful cats. And my friends and I try to meet at least once a week, either on Zoom or in a COVID safe way in person. And so I think that those kind of connections are very important if we're able to have them. And, and again, if we can't, then we can find them virtually, perhaps.
This is the second time in this interview you've mentioned cats, and as a cat person myself, I just can you just give me some insight into how they know when we're hurting? I mean, what is your professional observation of that?
I think cats and dogs are really empathic. I think they're really tuned in to their empathy. And so we as humans, I think sometimes um, elicit certain pheromones when we are either angry or sad or frustrated. And I think that cats and dogs are very perceptive to that. And so they're likely to come by and curl up against us or next to us. One of my cats, if I'm lying down and I'm having a tough day, he'll sit on my chest and he'll purr and be very, very gentle and kind of give me almost like a little hug with his paws. And I think cats and dogs really understand that. And that's what makes them so incredibly helpful. They give us unconditional love and support, especially when we're going through a hard time.
You talked at the start of the interview about the X-Men movie that changed and maybe even saved your life. Have you gone back and watched that movie since? And if so, what new
Mhm.
things have you seen in it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think honestly,
And
that
by the
movie
way, are we
still has
talking about X-Men Days of Future Past? Are we talking about an X-Men earlier movie? Which
the
one?
first X-Men,
Oh,
X-Men
the very first.
2000.
Oh, X-Men 2000. Got it.
Yes.
Got it. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And I mean, it still gives me the chills. X-Men Days of Future Past is my favorite,
Hmm.
but X-Men 2000 was the one that opened that door for me. And it was Halle Berry's depiction of Storm that really did it for me. My whole life, I felt like I was controlled by the weather, because my health gets so much worse when weather changes. But seeing Storm on the screen, being able to control the weather, just woke up something in me and made me rethink my own origin story. And after that, I started reading X-Men graphic novels and learned more about Storm and learned her origin story, very traumatic one, and her struggle with anxiety and claustrophobia. And she's my favorite superhero of all time. So still, every time I watch it, my heart just warms.
Well, my hero is Doctor Who, and that's true for a lot of our audience as well.
Yeah.
In your professional experience and also as a viewer, um, how does the Doctor help comfort and heal not just the characters around him or her in the show, but those watching at home also?
I can tell you a story about how that works. So, as a big Whovian myself too, a few years ago, I was working with a client. Let's call him Alex. That's not his real name. Alex was struggling with severe agoraphobia, so severe that the first time I came to his house, our first session was on either side of the bathroom door. Alex was too afraid to come out of the bathroom. And he was saying that he's really, really struggling. He hadn't been out of the house in years. He missed his children's games, birthday parties, weddings. But the one thing he was willing to talk about that he was really excited about was Doctor Who. He loved the 10th and the 11th Doctor. They were equally his favorite. And what he loved was that the Doctor, no matter what he was going through, would show up where there was trouble and would help people. And so the following week, I asked Alex if we could meet in his living room, and we did. And we talked about the Doctor and we talked about him. And he disclosed about his own trauma history. When he was a small child, he witnessed a triple homicide. And he didn't remember it until he was an adult. And then all of a sudden, he remembered it, and it incapacitated him and made it very difficult for him to leave the house. And so, as we were processing his trauma, we also invited the doctor in. So I asked him to think about having a conversation with the doctor, that maybe a doctor would have some kind of words of wisdom for him. And Alex broke down in tears because the doctor told him that Alex too can travel the world and help people wherever there's trouble, even if he's afraid. And that was really meaningful. And so a little while later, I'll never forget this moment. We stepped out of the house together, and Alex was holding onto the wall of his house with one hand. He was trembling and holding onto my hand with another. And he was just really, really nervous. And we stood there for about 20 minutes, just breathing and centering. And then he let go of my hand. He was like, all right, I can do this. And then the next session, we walked around the block. And a few sessions later, we drove around the block. And a few sessions later, he met me in my office. And then I'll never forget the day that he showed up and he said, I got my ticket. And so he and his wife were traveling to South America to do some humanitarian work. And it was really meaningful. And he said, I'm like the doctor now. And so I think that in so many ways, this is the show that's inspiring people. There are people who've stayed alive because they wanted to watch the next episode. They wanted to know what would happen next. There are people that ask themselves, what would the doctor do when they don't have anyone else to talk to? There are people that I've spoken to that feel like the doctor is the only one that understands that it's okay to be different. And so I think the show means so much to so many people, more than I think any of us could possibly comprehend in a 30-minute period.
Well, thank you to this doctor, and thanks to you for watching. Janina Scarlet, finally, if people want to learn more about you, where can they find you online?
I'm pretty much on all social media. If you look for Janina Scarlet, you'll find me, and my website is superhero-therapy.com.
Well, I think that has been super in so many ways. Thank you all for your attention today, and thank you, Dr. Scarlet.
Thank you.